Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me very great pleasure to ask James to deliver his lecture this evening, 70 years ago, How Universal Human Rights Were Being Made.
It wouldn't be a lecture these days without a handout. Although I realize that's old technology and it really should be downloaded onto your laptops, iPads, or actual implants. Since joining the Institute some years ago, I give a lecture every year or so, usually on some aspect of information communication law, on privacy, reputation, data protection, that sort of thing. And I was thinking about that for this year, and then I realized, as we all must, that the Institute is now celebrating its 70th anniversary since the foundation. And so I thought, what was happening 70 years ago? And I realized that just down the road, there are the beginnings of, this is supposed to go, supposed to have the video here, going. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was being drafted by a committee, but before the committee, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, got involved, human rights have been around for a long time. It's tempting to do a history of human rights here, but that would be a separate lecture. So I'll simply skim over some of the usual high points. That is the Cyrus cylinder, leaping forward to the Magna Carta, and with thanks to my wife, I wouldn't know about it otherwise, the Carta de Foresta, then the Petition of Right, the Bill of Rights 1688-89 in this country, the US Bill of Rights, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, both of them, about which a little more later, and then on to the Treaty of Versailles and minority rights, and up to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Four Freedoms. Now, Roosevelt, that's Franklin, made his speech about the Four Freedoms before the United States had entered the war. It was in the address to the Congress on the State of the Union in 1941, which conventionally is in January of every year. And he got the Four Freedoms, which were freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And this is the Norman Rockwell rendition. He got them perhaps from H.G. Wells. There are some who say that H.G. Wells was the originator of the Four Freedoms. However, there are also other interpretations which say that it wasn't so much H.G. Wells as Lord Halifax, who was the British representative in Washington, who had the influence. In any case, the Four Freedoms were in some variations under the heading of Why We Fight. And the Four Freedoms were used as a sort of international recruiting mechanism during World War II by the Allies. And in fact, the expression United Nations preceded the formation of the organization and was adopted as the name for the Allied nations. So it may have been H.G. Wells, it may have been Lord Halifax, but the Four Freedoms became transmuted into four rights, because all of these freedoms have correlative rights. Your freedom to speak involves a right, a correlative right not to interfere with that. And perhaps other correlative rights, such as, dare I say, a right of access to information. Freedom of worship involves a correlative duty on the part of others not to interfere, and perhaps other correlative duties as well. Freedom from fear involves a correlative duty not to intimidate, not to oppress. And freedom from what? Which is illustrated by almost certainly a traditional American Thanksgiving, involves the provision of basic human needs. So, after FDR's 4 freedoms, came the next step. And the next step was just down the road. In the first meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which took place in, it's not clear from here, the Methodist Central Hall. And one of the first things they did was to adopt a resolution to establish various commissions, including the Commission on Social and Economic Matters, and also to adopt a resolution to draft a universal Bill of Rights. There's a footnote here. That has to do with how these countries communicate. After World War I, one of the reasons, a small one probably, but perhaps one that contributed, to the relative inability of the League of Nations to do very much of anything about the threat of war was the fact that the interpreters in the League of Nations were interpreting on consecutive interpretation. That is to say, the speaker would say a few words, perhaps a paragraph, and then pause while the interpreter proceeded to say what the speaker had just said. I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but it is difficult, time-consuming, almost exactly twice as long, and can lead to misunderstanding. There is a story about someone, a businessman, I believe, who went to Moscow quite a few years ago in the days of the Soviet Union. And he had prepared his opening remarks, and he was told that he would have a consecutive interpretation. And he started up by saying, "Good morning, I am very pleased to be here, and I look forward to the opportunity of meeting with you and speaking with you and sharing our mutual experiences to our mutual advantage." I could have said that. So consecutive interpretation was not very efficient. Simultaneous interpreting was first adopted on a large scale at the Nuremberg trial, a year before this. And one aspect of the interpreting at Nuremberg was that the interpreter had to sit beside the speaker. Now, if you can imagine what this was like for some of the interpreters, most of whom were refugees from the Nazi tyranny, to be sitting next to Goebbels, Goering, and rendering their words faithfully into English, and perhaps, I think, with English and French, among others. So, simultaneous interpreting was adopted by the United Nations at the General Assembly and was used for many of the meetings, not all of them, in which the declaration was drafted. I say many of them because after a while, some of the drafting broke down into working parties and subcommittees who had a language in common. And so the General Assembly created the Economic and Social Council, and here is the bureaucratic, the organizational part of it, that the Economic and Social Council first created something unfortunately called the Nuclear Committee, which was nuclear only in the sense that it was the nucleus of the drafting process. The Human Rights Commission was then created by ECOSOC, which remained a permanent organization of the United Nations until it was replaced by the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Commission was made up of members who were appointed by and acted as representatives of their states, which may have been one of the reasons why the Commission was, how should we put it, less than even-handed in its later deliberations. The commission then appointed the drafting committee, which did the work, which then went on to the third committee of the General Assembly before it went on to the General Assembly vote. The drafting committee was René Cassin from France, Charles Malik from Lebanon, or the Lebanon, P.C. Chang from China, Herman Santa Cruz from Chile, Charles Duke, Lord Dukeston from the UK, William Hodgson from Australia, Alexander Bogomolov from the USSR, and John Humphrey. Now, John Humphrey is listed there as a member. He was actually the secretary of the committee. John Humphrey was Canadian. John Humphrey was completely bilingual. And John Humphrey was, not surprisingly, a lawyer, an academic lawyer. He also had lost his left arm in a childhood accident. And so perhaps it is significant that one of the things not particularly considered by the committee, looking through 3,000 pages of travel preparatoire, was anything to do with discrimination on grounds of physical ability or disability. Anyway, John Humphrey was a professor at McGill, and one of the reasons he was appointed to the UN, or approached for the job, was that he had just applied for the position of Dean of the McGill Law School and failed in the appointment process because he was considered to be too much of a lefty. One wonders what the history would have been if he had become dean. Of the others, René Cassin was a World War I veteran, and in the interwar years headed a veterans organization. At the time of World War II, René Cassin made his way to London, where he presented himself to Charles de Gaulle and offered his services. General de Gaulle said, "You are just what I need." Although being all he was said in French, then he said, "You are just the ticket," because the Free French needed some kind of legal organization. And so René Cassin was the legal representative, the legal advisor, the lawyer for the Free French all the way through the war, and so was the obvious appointment for after the war. He'd also participated in a drafting of a French Declaration of Rights of Man by the French Association of International Lawyers in 1929. So he had some experience in the process. Charles Malik from Lebanon was an academic, a professor. He was fluent in French and in English, and in fact had been a postgraduate student at Harvard when he was given a traveling fellowship in 1939, and he used the traveling fellowship to travel to Germany, where he studied under Martin Heidegger. His experience in Germany was not a pleasant one. Because of his appearance, he was attacked by Nazi thugs on the assumption that he must be Jewish. He cut short his fellowship and went back to Harvard, and he was available for appointment. P.C. Chang was an academic, a playwright, an artist, a man of many parts, and one might say a complete world sophisticate. He and Charles Malik were the philosophical, I won't say opposites, but they had interesting exchanges, including at the first meeting in Eleanor Roosevelt's apartment in Manhattan. The story is that René Cassin was not available because of storms in the Atlantic had delayed his crossing. And so the first meetings of the committee with Eleanor Roosevelt and Malik and Chang were philosophical discussions or disputes. And the record, at least the record of Eleanor Roosevelt's participation, was that she poured more tea and listened. Those were the most active members of the committee. Herman Santa Cruz from Chile was important particularly because the countries of Latin America were at the same time involved in the process of drafting the Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man, which was adopted in April of 1948 by the General Assembly of the newly created Organization of American States. These Latin American countries had often adopted constitutions which included a full range of rights, what are considered to be different generations, and we'll skip over that theory for now, of civil and political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And so when it came to drafting a declaration of the rights of man for the Latin American countries, and it could have included the United States, of course, they adopted a full range. And when the Latin American delegates, including Santa Cruz, became involved in the drafting of the Universal Declaration, they drew upon their experience. And in fact, there was not much controversy in the drafting process about those rights, such as the right to education, the right to work, the right to health care. Charles Dukes, according to most accounts, was not a very active or helpful participant. William Hudson from Australia was a vigorous advocate of an international court with the power to rule on whether states were in violation of whatever emerged from the process. Alexander Bogomolov from the USSR and others who came after him and some before mostly were representing the directions of the Soviet Union at the time. The directions were mostly in the nature of criticism of the records of Western countries and the United States in particular on civil rights and civil liberties. And John Humphrey, well, John Humphrey was the secretary. John Humphrey did the work. John Humphrey, before the first meeting, put together as many sources as possible. National constitutions, international documents. Oh yes, there was René Cassin, P.C. Chang, and both Eleanor Roosevelt and John Humphrey. And these are just some of the many influences. The American Law Institute had presented a draft list of the rights of man. The American Anthropological Association is notable not for a draft, but the fact that they put together a memorandum, which they sent to the United Nations, in which they urged the United Nations in drafting a human rights instrument, because at that point it wasn't clear what they were going to do, that it should avoid being ethnocentric. It should avoid attempting to declare that Western values were universal values. This memorandum gets cited a lot in literature on human rights, mostly in the discussion about whether human rights are truly universal or not. What is not often noted is that in 1999, the American Anthropological Association adopted another resolution in which they did not exactly recant. What they said was that human rights did represent universal values. It's just that the universal values were open to different interpretations as time elapsed. Not quite a climb down, but not quite the criticism that the first memorandum was. And then there was the Declaration of Bogota, which is the other name for the OAS Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man. And now to the process of drafting. There is a quotation that is usually attributed to Bismarck. It has different versions, but the usual version is that the making of laws, like the making of sausage, does not profit from close examination and does not increase the respect to the product. Actually, Bismarck probably didn't say it. It was probably said by a member of the state legislature in the state of Illinois sometime in the 1860s or 70s. But it sounds better if Bismarck said it. Over the 2-year process of drafting, there were lots and lots of issues. These are just a few of them. The first was the fairly obvious one, which did not have to do with the content of rights at all, but rather what they were involved in doing. Was it supposed to be a declaration, or a treaty, or something in between? And this process went on and on until a fairly late stage, although they fairly early on decided on parallel programs of work. One on a declaration, the other on something to implement it. The Australian position was probably the most extreme. That is, that there should be not only a binding treaty, but a court to enforce it. Other countries varied in what they were in favor of. The Soviet Union, from the beginning, was a fairly firm supporter of a declaration, and only a declaration, on grounds of national sovereignty, which was a little incongruous for a state based on internationalism. The United States, at one stage, wanted a treaty. At another stage, the later stages, decided that a declaration would be better, partly on grounds of getting something through, and partly when they realized that if it was going to be a treaty, they would have to get the president to sign it, which would not have been a problem, as Truman probably would have done it. But getting it through the Senate was another matter. The history of human rights treaties in general and the United States is one of presidential signature and a failure of ratification, because the Constitution requires the advice and consent of the Senate, and going back to the Treaty of Versailles, the Senate has been extremely reluctant to ratify almost anything. When the Senate finally got around to ratifying, this is leaping forward several decades, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it did so, subject to so many reservations that it was, in the opinion of many other signatories, not really worth the signature. So, Declaration of Treaty. The question of the right to life, and whether it began at conception, came up again and again. It never was actually treated as a make or break vote. One of the interesting things about the formal record is that there is not exactly a verbatim account of what was said, but a paraphrase of what was said. And then there is a statement that there was a vote, and whether the amendment passed or not, and by how many votes. What the Travo did not disclose is who voted how. And so you were left up to looking at the debates and attempting to conclude from the debates how they finally voted. There was also the question of God. As you probably know, there are different theories of human rights, that human rights come from a religious basis, or that human rights come from a rational basis. The drafters of the American Declaration of Independence said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," with a nod to the rationalists, that all men are created equal. Having it both ways, not the first or the last time. One other footnote, and that is that in his memoirs, John Humphrey says, he had the job of drafting a universal declaration. He called for a Jefferson, and he thought, I'm no Jefferson. In fact, he might have been reassured if he knew that Jefferson wasn't the only one involved in the drafting. They never are. And of course, there were women. Exactly what rights would they have if it was going to be based on a Declaration of the Rights of Man? The representative, this was not on the drafting committee, but rather on the commission from Denmark, was particularly vocal in asserting that whenever there was a doubt about whether women would be included, it should be in favor of inclusion. The residual reluctance to concede that women were equal, I would suggest, persisted on an unconscious level even to the post-declaration. Because there are many people who speak Spanish here. You may have noticed on the poster that Eleanor Roosevelt is holding up the Declaration. And the Declaration is Los Derechos del Hombre. Now, every time I see a Spanish description of the Declaration of Rights of Man, it's hermanos.
Mas.
Yeah, and so is hombre, I believe, is also exclusively masculine. So, maybe reading too much into it, but I would suggest that the use of hombre in the printing of this suggests that someone thought that a Declaration of Human Rights was really the rights of man, and man meant hombre. There were other issues related to women, especially when it concerned marriage and family. And some of the abstentions were based on a feeling that the Declaration about the rights in marriage perhaps went too far. So the timeline, as we're now encouraged to call the narrative, 1946. February to May was the Nuclear Committee. And in June, ECOSOC adopted, or rather recognized, the Commission on Human Rights. 47, in January, the Commission established the Drafting Committee, and it's never possible to tell how much the location of drafting influences what happened. But the first drafting session was at Lake Success, New York, which perhaps was optimistic or perhaps just a coincidence. It was in a World War II armaments factory. Then in June, the drafting committee went to consider the Humphrey draft. Now, in the years, decades since the Declaration, there has been a genteel, not dispute, but questioning about who was the real drafter, whether it was Humphrey or René Cassin. Some later French descriptions described René Cassin as the father of the Declaration. And at one point, Cassin referred to the Humphrey notes on a possible declaration. Probably, they were equally responsible in the sense that Humphrey provided the initial draft, the compilation of rights from a number of sources. René Cassin, of course, with the assistance and contributions of the others, put it together and reorganized it. And as we'll see later, René Cassin was responsible for constructing the Declaration in a coherent form. 1948 in May, the drafting committee met again in Lake Success. And in June, the commission sent the draft declaration to ECOSOC, again at Lake Success. And then in August, ECOSOC sent it to the General Assembly. From September to December, the third committee of the General Assembly considered the declaration. Now, by this stage, the third committee was taking its time. And Malik had taken over as chairman, as it was then, of the third committee. And they were up against a tight, well, a schedule. Malik, in order to encourage people to have their say and get on with it, instituted evening sessions. He then got a stopwatch and established a 3-minute limit for each speech. And by pushing ahead with it, he was able to get the declaration from the third committee to the General Assembly by December. Now, here is the format, the organization, the structure, which is René Cassin's main contribution. I don't know where that's gone, yes. He saw it not as a patched together collection of individual rights, but rather as a whole, with all the rights being interdependent and connected. And he used the analogy, the architectural analogy, of a portico, with the basic principles as the foundation stone: dignity, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. The preamble is citing the reasons, the steps, and then the 4 columns, with Articles 3 to 11 as the basic personal rights, life, liberty, and personal security. Articles 13 and 17, rights in a civil society, speech, among others. Articles 18 to 21, rights in the polity, and Articles 23 to 27, economic, social, and cultural rights, with Articles 28 to 30 being the duties, limits, and the overall purpose. This was his main conceptual contribution to the Declaration. Which then was referred to the General Assembly of then 58 members. The General Assembly voted. Among other things, it voted about whether to have a vote. And one footnote is that in the vote on whether to have a vote, Canada abstained. Upon inquiring, John Humphrey found that Canada had abstained because it felt that it could not legally agree to a declaration which gave it legal responsibility for matters that were reserved to the provinces under the Canadian Constitution, as it was then, which is the British North America Act. Upon his explanation that it was only a declaration, it didn't bind them to anything, they were reassured, and so when it came to a vote in the General Assembly, they voted in favor. 48 in favor, 8 abstained, and 2 absent. The abstainers, who did not give reasons for their abstentions, but some reasons can be guessed at from their contributions to the debate: Saudi Arabia, the Republic of South Africa, the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Belarus. Absent were Honduras and Yemen. So that was not quite 70 years ago, in 1948. And what do we do now? What next? When Eleanor Roosevelt made her speech in the General Assembly about the adoption, she referred to the Magna Carta of 1215, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1789, the US Bill of Rights, 1791. Those were important in the history. But what is not terribly well known is the fact that each of them was followed by something else. The Magna Carta, 1215, was followed by the Carta de Foresta, 1217. And for this information, I'm indebted to Professor Geraldine Van Buren, QC, who's also my wife. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man 1789 was followed by the Declaration of the Rights of Man 1793, which was never adopted by the French Assembly because by that time it had descended into the terror. But it was interesting in that it was more extensive than the first one. And for that information, I also am indebted to Geraldine. The US Bill of Rights 1791 was followed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, 1865 to 1870, because it took that long before the federal government, that long and the Civil War, before the federal government realized that it had to do something to make those rights a reality. And so what I'm suggesting is consideration or reconsideration of the Universal Declaration. Because in looking through the Declaration and the working papers and the debates, I noticed a few things. One is that there wasn't a single word about data protection, which is understandable considering that data protection is usually, in the words of the Council of Europe Convention, concerned with the automatic processing of personal data. And in 1946-48, a computer was a building at the University of Manchester and an idea in Alan Turing's mind. And so that is understandable, perhaps, although in H.G. Wells' Rights of Man, he had a provision about a right of access to records. So the idea was around, and it was an idea that was related to something else. There was nothing about, well, there was lots about freedom of information. There was even a separate commission on the subject. But nothing in it was about freedom of information in the sense of a right of access to government records. Not a word, although I'm open to correction if someone can find it somewhere in the transcripts. Which is perhaps understandable since of all the countries in the world, Sweden was the only one at that time which had such a law. And so things have moved on beyond the Declaration. And there's something else. When 58 people representing 58 countries gathered in Paris to vote on the Declaration, if the report of Alfred Kinsey, also published in 1948, was accurate, that is, that 10% of the population would have a sexual orientation other than the majority, it seems at least plausible that 10% of those would have had a different sexual orientation. But you will find nothing in the debates, the discussion, the travel preparatoire about discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation anywhere. So what I'm asking is it time for consideration for a Universal Declaration of Human Rights too? To use an expression that I believe younger people use, if I think they use it, they probably stopped a long time ago. Just asking. Thank you.